Welcome everyone to our fifth and final workshop in the series Working Well with Women with Disability. This workshop is focused on inclusion and it was developed and presented by Karen and myself, Siobhan Gibbs. This workshop series was developed by Wild in partnership with Work Up Queensland and Queenslanders with Disability Network. Women with disability were involved in all aspects of development, facilitation of live workshops, and recording of these videos. We use the term women with disability in this series, and I want to acknowledge that this is inclusive of all people that identify as being a woman and also those women that have a chronic health condition. We want to thank the women involved for sharing their experiences and their wisdom. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that we work and live on stolen land. I want to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. We want to also particularly acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that have contributed to this workshop series. And I want to acknowledge their ongoing wisdom sharing and support for our sectors. This was and always will be Aboriginal land. We wish to also acknowledge those people with disability that have contributed to this project and continue to support our sectors. Their wisdom is invaluable and they are paving the way for more inclusive and accessible communities and sectors. Today's workshop, we will be talking more so around inclusion in workplaces and support services, but of course there will be mention of gendered violence, abuse and neglect. So please make sure we're taking care of ourselves as these topics can be triggering or upsetting for some people. Feel free to pause the video at any time and come back to it and just go through this workshop at your own pace. It's also okay to feel challenged. This is a new field for many, and I particularly want to acknowledge, especially when we're talking about including women with disabilities as both clients and staff, I want to acknowledge that our sectors have been developed and often our funding and our resources have been developed not keeping in mind the additional support, funding and resources that are required to have more accessible workplaces and services. And therefore it can be really difficult and challenging and time consuming to adjust to provide better support to people with disabilities. I just want to remind you all that it's definitely possible, but of course we're doing the best we can with the best intentions within the work context and knowledge that we work within. So please keep that in mind. And always remember, if you do need support, to contact 1-800-RESPECT for anonymous counselling phone support. As I mentioned, this is the fifth and final in our Working Well with Women with Disabilities series, and this is targeted for a Queensland sector, particularly for the sexual violence, domestic and family violence, and women's health and wellbeing workers. So if you are coming from interstate, I do encourage you to have a look at the current supports within your state or territory in these areas. However, today's workshop should be valid nationally. So just keeping that in mind. There's more information in your handout about interstate support as well. Today's workshop will be covering some statistics and employment rates for women with disabilities, of course touching on the rights of women with disabilities, how to have accessible workplaces for women with disabilities, the experiences of employment of women with disabilities, supporting that employment, and resources and reflective exercises. I want to particularly acknowledge that this was developed with a lot of support from our focus groups, as myself and some of the other workers on this project don't have a lived experience of disability and haven't had to navigate the workplace or seeking support services in that way. And I really want to encourage you all to have an open mind, because I hope that after today's workshop, you'll be excited to employ and support more women with disabilities in your workplaces. In 2015, 49.4% of women with disability were in the workforce in Australia, which is a less than 1 in 2 rate of employment. So over 50% of women with disabilities are currently unemployed, which is a really harrowing statistic. And this is significantly lower than that of men with disabilities, who have a 57.4% employment rate. And currently the employment rates for women without disabilities is 71.6% of our female population that don't have a disability. So it is an extremely difficult society that we live in for people with disabilities to gain employment. Here we have just a bit of ABC article. Currently, the Disability Royal Commission is underway, and a lot of reporting around that is really highlighting the huge experiences of discrimination, abuse, neglect that particularly women with disabilities experience, especially in the workplace. It sees that a lot of people, particularly who have a intellectual disability or physical disabilities, are often perceived that they can't be good workers or effective workers. And unfortunately, we have a very ableist way of perceiving a person's workplace capacity. So we're going to sort of break that down a little bit more throughout this workshop. So disability employment particularly is very unique and definitely has progressed in recent years, but the style of employment still throws back to times where people with disabilities were exploited in workplaces. So Australian Disability Enterprises, otherwise known as ADEs, are often referred to as sheltered workshops. The NDIA refers to these as typically non-for-profit organisations that provide a wide range of employment opportunities for people with disability who require regular, ongoing and intensive supports in the workplace. A lot of disability advocates will particularly speak loudly about how they find these ADEs are a really deficit workplace for people with disabilities. Often those who work in an ADE, who gain employment in an ADE, will never leave that workplace, though they are meant to be designed to be upskilling people so they can access a mainstream workforce. And often too, their pay rates are subsidised through their NDIS plans, which therefore means that an employer isn't actually paying the employee the full minimum wage. It's being subsidised by the federal government, which comes with it that implicit bias that perceives a person with disability doesn't have as valid a reason to be receiving a full wage as someone who is able-bodied. So you can see how our employment system, even in the disability-specific space, is very ableist. Then Disability Employment Services, or DESs, often function through a job agency. So there's two ways that this operates. We have our Disability Management Service. So this is for job seekers that have a disability, injury or health condition who need assistance to find a job. And often these are job agencies, often mainstream job agencies that access additional federal funding to provide this support and often sometimes receive a fee when they do find someone a job or a placement. Hearing from some of the women who are part of our focus groups, they often feel a lot of pressure and they often feel very dismissed by these employment agencies. And then there's the Employment Support Service. So this is for job seekers who have a permanent disability, who need help to find a job and who need regular ongoing support in the workplace to keep that job. These are sometimes also through job agencies. Often too, this is working collaboratively with disability support services. So for example, if you have a permanent disability, you access NDIS support, you may have your wage subsidized by the NDIS through something like an ADE, and then the NDIS will also provide you with a support worker to attend work with you and support you at work. And these styles of working are definitely evolving and improving, but we're still needing a lot of change in our sector. ANRO's Whatever It Takes report was published in 2017 from memory, and this really was highlighting how difficult it is for women with disabilities to access domestic and family violence services. It's really important to perceive this information as though this is specifically as a service user. It's also valid as for women who have disabilities as being employees of support services. This is a really great poster that's nice and clear and you can access it. It's available in your handout to download and to use and display at your workplace, as it's got some really clear tips on how to be more inclusive. We'll break that down in a moment using our case study. Our first study is that of Janine. You are working at a domestic violence hotline offering phone support only. A woman named Janine calls requesting support with counselling. She left her perpetrator of violence 12 months ago and has moved interstate. Janine says that she uses a wheelchair and has had difficulty finding a service that is accessible. Janine also says she sometimes needs help with reading. So I encourage you now to pause the video as we have in the previous workshops, have a reflection around this case study, and then we're going to unpack it using that ANRO's poster. So what information would you need to support Janine, and what are your initial thoughts for referral or suggestions of support? So pause the video, and then when you're ready, come back to the workshop. When we're working in a practice context like a phone support service, obviously when we start engaging with someone, some of the key things we have to identify and make clear to the person we're working with is the barriers to the support that we can provide as a worker in that moment. So in this particular case with Janine, she is requiring some additional support, and all we can provide most likely is information and referral. However, where possible, it might be something that we as a phone support worker could actually look to seeking out what those possible other referral pathways could be and having a check-in with those support services about whether they're accessible. Some of the feedback we got in our focus groups was that a lot of the women felt this extreme burden on themselves to not only disclose their disability, but also then having to call multiple agencies, describe their disability and their support needs, to be often knocked back, which can be really exhausting and it can be really disheartening. And it's meant that for some women I spoke with, they didn't pursue seeking support for what was going on for them in their lives. A really key thing that we can do as workers is where we have capacity to try and do that ring around for them. And we can use here the 4 A's that they talk about in the ANROS Whatever It Takes report to analyse these support services as whether they're appropriate for a woman with disability. The first is to consider whether the service is approachable. So does the woman know how to get there? Is it easy to find? Do you feel safe going there? Is it within proximity to the perpetrator of violence? And is it potentially public transport accessible? Also, another thing to consider is that some public transport, such as train stations, particularly when they're not in a major metropolitan area, the stations might not actually be wheelchair accessible as they have stairs. Is the support service acceptable and appropriate? So does this mean, is it a good fit? And it means that often in an ideal situation, we as the worker call and find a support service, we feed that back to the person, for in this case Janine, and then check in to see if that sounds like a good fit for her. Is that something that she feels she wants to participate in? Never forcing anyone to do anything they don't want to do. Is it affordable? It should not cost money to get there, to be there, and to go as often as you need to. Sometimes this is then when we need to look at accessing additional emergency financial support or looking at other avenues of support. Is there a support person or a family member that's safe that can transport you to appointments? Because sometimes traveling great lengths and great distances, particularly by taxi or rideshare, can get really expensive, and particularly if there's a lot of appointments. So being innovative and making sure it's always affordable. And is it available? So that means, is it there for the person and that they can use it like any other person would? And that's a really key element of what I hope that you take away from this workshop, is that a woman with disability should never feel like a nuisance, a burden, or being too difficult when accessing a service. A lot of the women, when we were discussing at the focus groups around accessing support, a lot of them spoke about how they were made to feel by workers when they had to share their access needs, or when they had to cancel appointments or change them because they weren't feeling well that day. It's really important to always come back to the fact that we as a worker in our role is to provide the best suited service for that person, and that it is always a client-centered approach we take. And of course, sometimes that just means acknowledging where the barriers exist or where the additional considerations need to be made, and doing that in a way that isn't at a deficit of the person. For that reason, that I would really encourage you all to involve women with disabilities in your service. So hearing their stories, participating in training like this is a great first step, but also the voice doesn't always tell a story, it also has an owner. So always acknowledging sometimes we can take a person with disabilities experience and retell it, but always remember there's a person behind this experience. Peer support groups are really useful, always collaborating with women with disabilities and always including women with disabilities on your board or planning groups. This is definitely something that even at WILD, as a specialist disability service, we are increasing our capacity and understanding of how we can be more inclusive, particularly structurally and organisationally, of women with disability. And by having a person's lived experience inside, it means that us as often able-bodied workers aren't making assumptions about what someone needs, and we can directly hear what someone needs to access our service, which is invaluable. Another point that the Anne Rose report makes is services need to work together. And we talked about that interagency approach in the previous workshop. And they talk about one size does not fit all in this whatever it takes report, that one t-shirt is not going to necessarily fit every single person. And the example they give here is you pack the t-shirt and you take it everywhere you go. It stretches and changes with you. Services can see it and don't need to ask you what t-shirt you want. So a big thing here is always saying that a person at the center is the expert of what they need and the expert of their lived experience. And as best as we can, we need to create resources and information sharing that, of course, is always at the heart. Consent is provided by the client, but we are working collaboratively. Systems we've developed in Queensland, such as the high risk team, is a great example of how an interagency approach can be super effective in diminishing the risk of lethality and violence and abuse that a woman can experience, particularly for a high risk team, domestic and family violence, but in all circumstances. And where possible, creating interagency meetings that a client is also present for and involved with can be a great solution, ensuring a wraparound support so a person is safe. Also, collecting and using information about the experiences of women with disability with women with disability. So as much as it's been really exciting to take this information, these workshops, to share with workers about the experiences of women with disability, it's also important to acknowledge that I myself do not have a disability and that I'm sharing secondhand information. But a great thing as well that we found as a great byproduct of the focus groups was that women all with disabilities were able to share their lived experiences with each other and feel a lot less isolated in what happened. There was a lot of people sharing their story and a lot of people saying, oh, wow, that happened to me as well. So where possible, always sharing that cyclically, embedding it within your organization with workers so we can better understand, sharing it with other women with disabilities so they don't feel isolated or like the only ones at your service. And then furthermore, analyzing and collecting that data to report back to your funding bodies so that you can access more resources and support to be a more inclusive workplace. So what does accessibility mean? In the Whatever It Takes report, accessibility acknowledged as not only being physical accessibility, so not just physically modifying or accommodating or providing interpreters for people with sensory impairments. It must also include how services think about disability, so attitudinal factors. So is there an unconscious bias, perception, or resistance to working with women with disabilities and interrogating that? So accessibility also means how information about services is made available. Are you proactively sharing easy read flyers? Are you proactively sharing your information with the disability community? Going beyond procedural access requirements set out in the Disability Discrimination Act, it's important to acknowledge that that act now is 20 years old and we need to often work beyond those requirements. Consider them as the absolute minimum. Another addition that one of my co-facilitators, Karen, made was having a framework to consider an understanding of disability and violence and the intersection between those two things. And just having that as an additional guidelines, an additional way of perceiving the experiences of violence of women with disabilities and getting as much consultation from women with disabilities for all of these different changes to your organization. I want you now to imagine your service from the perspective of a woman with disability. Imagine thinking about it was your first appointment attending your service and considering it from different disability perspectives. Person might have mobility aids. They may need to bring a support person with them. They may have an intellectual disability. If your workplace is unmarked, how can you provide support to ensure someone knows where to go? Is it physically accessible? Is there a step into your workplace? So thinking about it, utilizing the senses as well. So what does it feel like when you get there? What can you smell? Do you have music playing? What can you hear? Is there opportunities for sensory deprivation, as people may have experiences such as hyperacusis, in which background noise is very difficult and can cause a migraine for some people, as well as other sensory experiences where scent can be really uncomfortable for people and stressful. And what can you see? What is there around you? And often that also means, if I'm a woman with disability, can I perceive that I will be welcome here? Do I feel like I'm the only person? So just take a minute now to pause, and I really encourage this to be a discussion that you have with your co-workers, thinking about what it might feel like to be a woman with disability accessing your service as both a client or a staff member. So pause the video, have a discussion, and then come back to the video. I hope you've had a rich discussion and reflection. And this is definitely something that is a never-ending conversation that happens at Wild, I know in that workplace and other workplaces right now. A lot of services and supports have been in an older building that was not designed to be accessible. Modifications are expensive and funding is limited. So often our workplaces aren't as accessible as they possibly could be. But it's important to start considering those bare minimum requirements and how we can make them more welcoming to people with disabilities. Because it is really clear, as we discussed earlier on in the workshop series, that a woman with disability is much more likely to experience violence, abuse, or neglect than that of a woman without a disability. So we need to definitely ensure our services are accessible. So that might mean considering, of course, entrances and exits being accessible. Are the toilets accessible? Do they have handrails? Is there a lip when you enter? Is the sink at a height that would be okay for someone that was in a wheelchair? Do you have braille or audio described flyers or information available? If not, do you have access to interpreters and support services? Do you have access to interpreters or support services that can make your information more accessible? Do you have easy read flyers or resources? And if you don't, could you possibly develop some of those? Is there flexibility in how your appointments are delivered? Can you offer an earlier or later start time? Or can the appointment occur over Zoom or at someone's home if it's deemed to be safe? Are there private rooms with no sound bleed? Could you meet someone at their house or in an easier place to meet? Obviously, like I mentioned, Zoom or teleconferencing options. Do you play music? Is there perfume used? Consider those sensory implications. And does your organisation have a framework and policies for guiding working with people with disability? And these things should always be developed in collaboration with people with disabilities. And I encourage you to have a look at organisations such as the Queenslanders with Disability Network and other advocacy services to help you develop a disability inclusion policy and framework for your workplace. In Australia, all employees have rights that cannot be taken away, and this is inclusive of women with disabilities. And sometimes when women with disabilities have experienced so much discrimination and exclusion from the workplace in their lifetimes, they can make assumptions that when they are being mistreated, that might be permissible because they are just grateful to access employment, for example. And talking to a couple of women, they said that was their experience when first entering the workplace. They felt this extreme othering that was happening, discrimination. However, were never provided the information really clearly about what their rights are. And a lot of us as employees don't understand what our rights are as employees. So it's important to always share this with women that you are employing and working with. So of course, everyone has the right to be paid fairly for the work that they do. Minimum wages are set out in the awards that are listed, and it is essential that regardless of someone having a disability or not, that they are always paid fairly. And encourage people to look at the Fair Work website and to check themselves and confirm themselves that they are being paid a fair wage. You can find more information about these rights at work for women with disabilities in particular, but they're actually for all employees. And always reminding someone, particularly when you're employing a woman with disability, that they have a right as a person, regardless of their disability, to always have their needs met and accommodated at work. That is the bare minimum, and it's legislation. So I think it's really important that we really reassure people that often throughout their lives have felt like they've been too much trouble or difficult and have been made to feel that way, that in fact that's not the case, and that every person should have all their needs accommodated, particularly when it comes to their health, well-being, and safety in the workplace. There is financial support available for employees, and these is through access through the Disability Employment Scheme, or the DES funding that I spoke about earlier, and this can be accessed through an approved NDIS plan. So if you're supporting someone that is reviewing their NDIS plan or getting a new NDIS plan, it's really important to advocate for them to get additional DES funding so that they can enter the workplace. The Employment Assistance Fund is a federal fund that can be accessed by any employer and any employee to help with the cost of making adjustments to your physical workplace, so modifications to work vehicles. This also means special equipment for the workplace. So considering those access needs, there's actually financial support for workplaces to be able to install these with evidence that that's what your employee requires. There is information and communication devices can be funded for. Auslan interpreting services can be paid for through this fund. Also, specialist services for employees with specific learning disorders and mental health conditions. So this might mean additional support workers or adjusting the style of work. It also covers the cost of disability awareness training for your workplace, including deafness awareness. So upskilling fellow employees so that you can all together support each other in the workplace. And this also covers mental health awareness and first aid training. And I'd really encourage you to advocate in your workplace to access this funding, even just to get training so that you are ready, employment ready for women with disabilities to access your service. Because there's nothing better than arriving in a workplace and knowing that your needs are going to be met and not having to always be advocating for yourself. I think that this quote from Karen, who co-designed this workshop with me, really summarizes how we can really promote the independence and empower women with disabilities to be employees. I'll always be dependent on others for my self-care, for transport, but my employment I will always be able to do independently. All I need is a computer and an internet connection, and I can do that without needing to rely on anybody else. If there's one thing that has been a sort of silver lining to the pandemic, is that we've learned to be a lot more flexible in how we work, and working from home is a much more viable option for people, and definitely something to consider as being an offering for all employees, particularly those women with disabilities, as they can be in a comfortable environment that they know will meet all of their support needs. It's also important that we are encouraging the economic resilience of women with disabilities, particularly those that are leaving domestic and family violent relationships or have experienced sexual violence or other forms of abuse, neglect, and discrimination, often depending on a carer or other supports to provide financial support. By empowering women to have economic independence, we can help support them to move forward in their lives and move beyond this experience of trauma. We'll now have our final case study for the series, and that is that you were a project lead on a new program to provide peer support to women who are survivors of domestic violence. Part of this role is to recruit peer workers who have a lived experience of disability and domestic and family violence. Your workplace has never employed someone with a disability before, and there is little support internally for these new staff. So what are the first steps you need to consider before employing the new workers? And what would be some considerations you'd need to make? So pause this video and then come back to the video. It's really important within these contexts that as we become more inclusive and more aware, and we understand how important it is to diversify our workplaces to be more inclusive, to not only support various employees, but also to provide better access and support for women with disabilities and other women with diverse identities to get support in our workplaces. It's really important to acknowledge those limitations, and that often that means that there will be an experience for a lot of people where they have to be the first person entering your workplace, that their needs need to be accommodated. So of course, keeping in mind that employing peer workers is a great addition to your workplace. It's something that we've done at Wild, and we've found that an incredibly exciting way to diversify our workplace, but also to be better engaged with the disability community by working alongside them and not for them or on their behalf. I always want to encourage that we never make anyone feel uncomfortable or a nuisance for accommodating their needs. We should, and everyone should, as Fair Work stipulates, feel that they are not a burden and that everyone's support needs should be met when entering the workplace. To conclude, pause this video and have a read of some of these quotes. These are collected from not only the focus groups for this project, but other focus groups that Wild has held. And I'll just pick a couple of these out to share with you all now as some closing thoughts. We need accessibility in recruitment practice or policies. Otherwise, we can't even get an interview. Feminism. Often workplaces are designed for men by men. So it's hard to find my place as a woman, but also as a woman with disability. You bring a whole person to work every day. So that includes my gender, my disability, and everything should be acknowledged. To conclude this workshop and our workshop series, I'd now encourage you to listen to my final in conversation with Karen, who helped co-design and develop this workshop as well as workshop 1. And she shares her thoughts as being a woman with disability, as both a service user and an employee.
Welcome everyone to our final in conversation for our final workshop, workshop 5, including women with disabilities as clients and staff. And I'm joined again by Karen, who was my co-facilitator for the first workshop. Welcome back, Karen.
Hello.
Karen, we're talking about including women with disabilities as clients and staff. And I wondered if you could give us a bit of a brief summary of the work that you currently do as your employment.
Sure. So currently I actually work as a consultant, and I have a number of organisations that I do consultancy work for, like, for example, Wild and WorkUp and QDN and a few other organisations, TAFE Queensland, where I offer my expertise as a person with disability, and in various, I work in various policy spaces as well, offering advice and responding to written policy work. So yeah, that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's really cool. And I think that's definitely something that we've sort of tried to do with this workshop series, is working with women with disabilities. Because it's difficult when you're watching training or workers without a disability describing the experiences of someone with disability when they don't know it themselves.
That's right.
That's
right.
So I guess in your experiences, Karen, what has been, have you ever gone to like access a service, I guess, around maybe counselling or to get support that you felt that they've said they can be accessible, but then it hasn't really been accessible? It doesn't have to be a service either. It could be any sort of place you've been
so
to.
for me, the key thing around that, which has kind of a relevance to our topic of family and domestic violence, is around holiday accommodation. That's been a big thing for me, where you look on something on the internet and it says completely accessible, and then you get there and there's a step into the room or something like that. So that's been a huge barrier to, like, you know, enjoying a holiday or time away from home. And I imagine, like, for women with disability escaping domestic violence, that would be like a huge issue.
Yeah, incredibly difficult, because a lot of refuge accommodation is often in hotels and motels.
Yeah, so it would be about the worker or the service having a thorough knowledge of where there is accessible accommodation, or accommodation calling themselves accessible. And actually, I would suggest, because for my previous employer, that's what we always did. When we were putting up members in accommodation, we would do an accessibility check. And because I use a rather large mobility device, often I would be asked to run out and just check out that a particular accommodation site was accessible. Because the theory was that if I could get my chair through the door, then everyone will be all right. So yeah, so that was quite a good part of my job, because I felt that we weren't leaving people in the lurch in potential inaccessible accommodation. So I didn't mind that.
That's a great, and I guess for workers, that could be something even calling ahead for the woman, would you say, and asking some of those questions about accessibility?
That's right.
Absolutely. And I think
there'd be websites that workers could go to find out minimum requirements, and you could just ask, is your door this wide? For example, in my home, all my internal doors are at least 900 millimetres wide, and then my back door is 1.2 metres wide. It's a nice, you can fully open it to 1.2 metres, and then I'm not sure how wide my front door is, but it's a automatic door that I can get in and out of independently. So so that's important for me, obviously.
Absolutely. And I think a reminder to accessibility isn't just the physical space as well.
Absolutely. It's about ensuring that for a woman with intellectual disability, for example, that your information is easily understood and available in different formats, easy read, easy English. It's all for a woman who has some kind of sensory impairment, for example, blind or deaf. It's about ensuring that you've got information that's accessible to her too, or that you're able to connect with an interpreter, an Auslan interpreter if she's deaf. And women with disabilities also come from different cultural backgrounds as well. So you might be also working with interpreters that speak other spoken languages other than English. So they're all things you need to be mindful of with women with disabilities, as you would be with any other woman.
Absolutely. And I think another thing too is where it's appropriate, a woman with disability should be able to bring a carer or support person.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. And where your service isn't accessible, I think it's about working with women with disabilities around, seeking their advice about how can we make ourselves more accessible, because we know that when people with disabilities, or in this case, women with disabilities, are included in the design and creation of services from the beginning, that they're more likely to be accessible and inclusive from the start, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's easier to build with accessibility in mind, less than make adaptations. But
that's correct. That's absolutely true.
So I guess sort of shifting from being a service user into being an employee, I wondered if you could share with us a positive example when you've got into a workplace and they've been able to sort of suitably support you with your disability to be able to work as a staff member.
Sure. So I've worked in a wide variety of roles for the last 25 years. Since I graduated from university, I started out in the tertiary sector as a research assistant, then went on to work for various disability peak bodies, including those in the disability policy space, as well as housing, and I've worked in those sort of spaces and some community organisations as well. So I worked up in those sort of spaces up until a year ago when I needed to have a bit of a mind shift around working in more flexible arrangements because of COVID, and I preferred to work from home. So I then got an ABN, and I've been providing specialist advice and all sorts of things to a number of organisations since then. I'm predicting your next question might be around where have I had a negative experience.
Yeah.
And this is a good segue, is that often people get caught up in, oh, that's special treatment, but it's not really. It's just giving me the same access that everyone else has by doing even every doorway in that office. It didn't offer me anything extra that anyone else didn't already have. So that's a really good thing to think about.
Absolutely. So let's follow that segue. And
I'm a genius.
Yeah. And yeah, I guess share with us a negative sort of workplace experience, particularly.
So I mean, I've had a really lovely career, and I can't really think of specific negative examples other than just themes. And one that comes up over the years is that, and it's a subtle nuance, but it is very different. Sometimes, so those things that I was talking about in the first positive example are things called reasonable adjustments. But sometimes people get confused and they think you're talking about special consideration. And I have had situations in the past where people, like line managers and even CEOs, have said, why would I offer that to you? I'm not offering that to anyone else. And I'm like, I've had to like do a bit of self-advocacy and say, well, it actually isn't a special consideration. This is a reasonable adjustment. And, like do a bit of education and advocacy. And it's a reasonable adjustment for these reasons, because I have, certain disability issues, or I have medical issues that are associated with my disability. So therefore I need, for example, I need a slightly later start in the morning, or I need a slightly shorter work day, or I need, like another example that comes to mind is that I might need a bit of extra time off while we get through this COVID experience, or a longer period working from home, or, those sort of things.
Absolutely. And I think people need to acknowledge that it's not that by providing extra support for a person with disability, you're giving them special treatment or giving them priority over other staff.
That's right.
Just sort of levels the playing field, so we're all working at the same access point.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And you're actually providing a means for them to be more productive in the workplace.
Yeah. And I think that's something broadly across workplaces throughout our COVID pandemic period, and a lot of working from home, which was a difficult adjustment for some, but I think we can all agree that flexibility has been such a welcomed adaptation to work life for people with or without disabilities. And I think gives
correct.
Yeah, it can give people that might not have a disability insight into how having a bit more flexibility in how you work and the hours you work and where you work can really increase how you're able to function at work.
That's right. And there's been like some good aspects of COVID, like those sort of flexible work arrangements and women with disabilities being able to access things like talking to a doctor over the telephone and like that's been great. Like not to say that, it hasn't increased people's isolation and that's been a worry, but, there's been some really inclusive things that have happened as a result of COVID, and it would be great to see those things continue.
Absolutely. I agree. Absolutely. I guess like for a lot of our in the workplaces, the workers that will be watching this video are often in community services, gendered violence support services, women's health services. And so what would you suggest to those workplaces when they're recruiting or employing a woman with a disability? What do you think are some core things they should keep in mind?
Yeah, like we were saying before about the designer services, I think it's really important to have inclusivity at the very start of things, so that, you know, in terms of employing people, often where you start is the employment package that goes out. So having really nice inclusive messages in that package saying we're a diverse workplace and we welcome applications from, you know, women who are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background, from a different culture, and who have disability. I think they're really good messages to have. I think making sure your recruitment processes are accessible and you're not inadvertently disadvantaging people by having processes that are difficult to understand, or interview questions that people might find hard to understand, or that are not directly related to the selection criteria. I think that's really important. And to have processes where people are openly able to engage about their disability in the interview process, you know, because not everyone will state up front in an application process that they have a disability. But I think it'd be really nice to create a welcoming environment where you are encouraging the applicant to ask questions of you as the employer, and certainly answer queries about how can we make, you know, if you were the successful applicant, how we can make our workplace more accessible for you. I remember one example of an interview I went to, and it was the same organisation that advocated to make all their doorways wider. They actually said after the interview, we'd like to show you the office. So if you were the successful applicant, you would feel comfortable with a level of access, and we can sort other things out later by accessing other programs and services. But we want to make sure that, you know, if you were successful, then for the first couple of weeks you'd have a desk you can sit at, and would you like to look at the office? And I kind of saw that as a good sign. But I think that's like also a good example of inclusion as well, and ensuring that you take the needs of the person with disability into account.
Absolutely. That's a really great example. Just like literally giving a person an opportunity to see the space before their first day.
Yeah, that's right. And that was even before I knew I had the job, you know.
Yeah, that's fantastic, especially if noise and smell and other access needs need to be accommodated to by actually viewing the space beforehand. You can quickly identify those things.
A lot of people, a lot of organisations now are working in these open office spaces, which may or may not be helpful for some women with disabilities who have sensory issues.
Absolutely. Yeah. Each workplace varies, so it's important that a person has a really clear idea. Because also too, that can mean if the woman with the disability is successful, she might choose not to take on that employment because it's actually not suitable for her, but she can make that informed choice.
Or she might have strategies that she's worked in other workplaces that can get around those barriers, but she's able to proactively address those because she's been able to see the work site.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I guess in a final point, Karen, when we think about work and how important work is, especially for women with disabilities who've experienced gendered violence, what would be any of your closing thoughts why it's important?
Well,
to have
I think like for all women escaping violence, but particularly women with disabilities, the opportunity, like we can't underestimate the idea that employment is actually a pathway out of violence, because employment, as we all know, increases our economic security and means we are able to leave potential or real violent situations, and it just provides that pathway and that sense of security, and I think that can't be underestimated.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's just as important, or if not even a little bit more important, for women with disabilities who may be more dependent on their perpetrator for other things, such as like intimate personal care and just getting through life. So I think if we can take some of the barriers away through providing employment opportunities, I think that's all the better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me, Karen, and for sharing those thoughts with us. It's been incredible to have your wisdom.
It's been a great series.
Thank you so much, Karen.
I'd like to thank you all for watching and listening and participating in not only this workshop, but the entire Working Well with Women with Disabilities series. I'd like to acknowledge and thank once again all of the women who have contributed to this project and have shared their invaluable wisdom. Not only do I think that we have together all learnt a lot in this workshop, but I know myself, I've learnt so much, and I feel very grateful to have had these really enriching conversations with these wonderful women. I'd like to also remind you all to please check out the handout for not only this workshop, but the whole series, which will give you a heap of additional information. Please keep an eye on Work Up Queensland, Queenslander with Disability Network, and Wild Sexual Violence Prevention's websites. They all have additional training, resources, and opportunities for you as a worker to upskill, as well as advice around finding accessible and appropriate services for women with disabilities. I encourage you all to keep an eye on this space. This sector is ever evolving, ever growing, and I wish you the best of luck in expanding and continuing to work inclusively with women with disabilities. I've been Siobhan Gibbs. Thank you for watching.